Does the referendum in California prevail over legislation? This question periodically gets raised. For example, two bills that were signed into law in the fall of 2022 by Governor Gavin Newsom here in California, the opponents of those two enacted measures are seeking to overturn those two enacted bills. The answer to this question points to the inherent conflict between powers set forth in Articles 2 and 4 of the California Constitution. Nonetheless, the brief answer to the question of does the referendum prevail over legislation is of course it does. Legislators and proponents of successfully enacted legislation often spend a year or more advocating for a bill that's gone through the entire legislative process. Undoubtedly, that's part of extensive debate, maybe a myriad of amendments, multiple votes in legislative committees in both houses, on the floors of both the Senate and the Assembly, and then, of course, the final action by the governor. And so that recently enacted statute should be sustained in their mind. And of course, Article 4 sets forth the role of the legislature. In Article 4, Section 1, it says, the legislative power of the state is vested in the California legislature, which consists of the Senate and Assembly. Of course, there's also a clause that follows, but the people reserve to themselves the powers of initiative and referendum. Hence, although the lawmaking power is clearly granted to the legislative branch of our state government, that power is still limited by the other constitutional powers reserved to the people, that of initiative, making laws, and referendum, overturning an enacted law. Moreover, Article 2 sets forth the role of the state's electorate and covers voting and the three forms of direct democracy: initiative, referendum, and recall. And these three forms of direct democracy are all alive and well in the state of California. In Article 2, Section 9A, it provides that the referendum is the power of the electors to approve or reject statutes or parts of statutes, except in four instances: urgency statutes, statutes calling elections, statutes providing for tax levies, and statutes providing for appropriations for usual current expenses of the state, basically the budget. So do these two provisions of the state constitution in Article 2, direct democracy, and Article 4, the legislative power, provide a post-enactment opportunity for citizens, and of course, by extension, powerful interest groups, to override the extensive work completed by the legislature and governor? Yes, is the answer. Of course, that is what was intended by the Constitution. First, in delegating the lawmaking power to the legislative branch of our state government in Article 4, Section 1, again, it states clearly, but the people reserve to themselves the powers of initiative and referendum. So clearly the citizens have provided a split in the lawmaking duties between themselves and the legislature. And while the legislature is obviously the primary lawmaking body in the state, the electorate can also make laws by adding, amending, or repealing provisions of the state constitution, as well as state statutes. And they can do so by initiative. They can also repeal statutes or even parts of statutes that were enacted by the legislature and governor through the referendum process. Second, Article 2 grants the state's voters the power of referendum to specifically approve or reject statutes or even parts of statutes that were enacted by the legislature and governor. And a close reading of Article 2, Section 9, this constitutional provision tells us the referendum power is granted to the people before the lawmaking power is granted to the legislative branch, because it's the people's political powers that are established in Article 2, while the legislative branch's powers are granted in Article 4. As a result, despite the frustration often that proponents and authors of enacted legislation may feel when facing a referendum effort, the referendum is a tool that may be utilized by the state's electorate as a check against the lawmaking power of the legislative branch of state government. Finally, if a referendum qualifies after a 2-year session, the referendum doesn't necessarily have to wait nearly 2 years for a vote of the statewide electorate. That's because while Section 9 of Article 2 provides that the Secretary of State will submit the referendum measure at the next general election held at least 31 days after the referendum qualifies, it can also be at a special statewide election held prior to the general election. And Section 9C specifically provides the governor may call a special statewide election for that measure. As a result, once a referendum qualifies for the statewide ballot, then the governor can call a special election for the people to vote on that referendum and decide whether to accept or reject the statute, rather than waiting until 2 years later to do so.